Hi, everybody. We're going to give everybody just a minute to get in, and then we're going to get started. Give everybody a couple minutes once we start the webinar. It gets everybody logged in. Excuse me. We'll always give everybody a minute or two to connect. There they come. They're coming. Just wait one more minute. All righty. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome everybody to the latest chat in our series of webinars. We are really happy to be able to continue bringing this series of extremely informational chats to all of you, especially in this case to keep you up to date with the happenings in the cannabis industry. I'm Frank Niesebaum, VP of Sales for C2B Tech, and I'll be your host today. I'm also happy to welcome back Jim McCoy, who's the Director of Operations and Managing Partner of Verde Compliance Partners. Hi, Jim.
Hello.
So Jim, again, will be sharing his extensive experience with the ATF and the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. You'll hear us mention TTB quite a bit as Jim's speaking and we're asking questions and getting in conversations, because that's important to help understand the issues that there are around compliance, especially in the cannabis industry. So last time, you know, it's interesting, we spoke a lot about the requirements around licensing for the cannabis industry, especially around what the federal impact probably will be as it, you know, becomes more of a legalized thing nationally. So now what we want to do is, it's funny, now we want to say, okay, we're all licensed, what do we do now? So we'll talk about that today. So again, welcome, Jim. And Jim we'll be talking about the pitfalls of compliance. So as we usually like to do, we'd like to start with just a couple of quick poll questions to gauge the audience a little bit. And the first one is, you know, we just want to get a sense if you're open for business, and the answers are pretty straightforward. Yes, you're fully operational. Yes, but there's some modification. Maybe you're working from home, that type of thing. Or no, you're not open yet, or, you know, for whatever reason, you may not be. So we'll give you a few seconds here, a minute or so, to answer the poll on the screen. I know you're out there, just not getting answers. Okay. Not sure if maybe we're not seeing the questions, but we'll move to the second. Oh, there we go. We're getting somebody answering now. Give another second. Okay, it looks like most people are operating. So we'll move to the second question, and obviously kind of applicable to what we're working on, talking about today. Just curious as to whether you have concerns about compliance with federal and state regulators, maybe what you're experiencing now, or if you are concerned, just trying to get a gauge. Okay, well, thank you. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So, Jim, I know you have a lot, we have a lot to talk about. I guess my first question is, we know that federal legalization is still kind of uncertain. So why should companies start to prepare now to comply with the rules that don't even exist yet, or at least are in infancy?
Well, as most new businesses, you want to show some measure of prudence and diligence in looking at what you do, even with things that aren't in a force yet. The federal legalization is something that we're pretty certain is on the way, and it's starting to take form in the structures that are in the bills that are pending in Congress. Congress can either suddenly do something, or it may trundle along and not take a while, but we know it's coming. It's like the freight train coming at us. We did cover last time we talked about the entry process, where transition from state-only licensing to a full federal permits and what that entails. That's very natural as a first thought. But just like the dog that runs after the car and catches it, you're going to get there and you're going to have a permit in hand, and you're going to wonder what to do, and not only what to do and how to comply, but how do you avoid getting in trouble with this thing, meaning tax issues, permit issues, etc. Yeah. So everybody should kind of think ahead and have a plan as to how they're going to comply, and how is this taxation structure on top of what the states is already doing is going to look, and how it's going to work.
Right. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I know we've had, throughout our webinars over the last couple of months, a lot of this has been about planning. And I think you hit that right on the head. And I know that from the state perspective, state cannabis license holders already keep records for the state, like you mentioned, pay taxes and file reports. What's different about what the federal records and reports and tax filings are going to come about? So obviously federal state is always a little different.
Well, the difference is in thinking about the approach. The federal, the rules, everything I've read is all focused on manufacturers and possibly somewhat on distribution, importing, exporting, things that involve interstate commerce. The states naturally are focused primarily on what goes on in their own state. They're focused on retail, on ultimate consumers. They're focused on ensuring that the products that enter the state are properly legal. They may register, as with alcohol, out-of-state shippers. And there's a myriad ways of states doing things. As I always tell people, they say, well, how does the federal match the state? Well, pick a state. There's 50 ways of doing it, plus the territories. So I've even worked a lot with like Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, Caribbean Basin issues. So it's going to be a big, complex world with a lot of local regulation. And then as you move upward, the federal regulation will, as we're seeing in these bills, they will tax the product at a percentage of the sale price, and some products will be exempt. So we'll have to be looking at how that all is going to be applied. There are already existing federal rules about how to apply that federal tax. But the big difference is the scope. You're talking about interstate, and you're talking about the Federal Internal Revenue Code, which will make sure everything has a lot of procedures in place to deal with tax collection and reporting requirements.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, I think, one of the things that we've seen, again, obviously in the ERP space or accounting space, we're representing and working with software that already at least takes into account the 280E taxation pieces. And that's really about having the right things in your ledger recorded and tracked the right way so that you can report. But obviously this is going to be a lot more extensive in terms of what's there. And so, when a company's federal permit is approved, what's the first compliance consideration they should be preparing for, in terms of all the pieces?
Well, as the first thing I would say is look at tax, tax, and tax. Those are the first three considerations. You're going to be using existing record systems and adapting them to the specific line-by-line requirements of the federal rules. You're going to be tracking, if this tax is based on sale price, you're going to be determining which price do I use. The federal government Internal Revenue Code has a lot of specific rules that are involved with establishing what the sale price is, especially when you get related companies, when you get what they call less than arm's length transactions. And the government can dictate to you by regulation what the proper price is, and you can request that determination. Now, how quick you get it, I don't know, but there's a lot of existing rules, and if you go by percentage of sale price, there's a number of products that are taxed that way. And so you'd be looking at the cigar rules primarily because there's a lot of rulings on hand to follow, but it is the most complex method for taxation by excise tax. I mean, you're just having unit taxes where you've got like a proof gallon of spirits, a barrel of beer, or each individual cigarette by the thousand. There's different rates. But when you use the sale price, it's the most easily manipulated, and also the riskiest in terms of how you can misinterpret and end up owing more tax.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I think somewhere we talked about the MORE Act. Is that something that already exists, or something people should be aware of?
Well, the reason I bring the MORE Act up is it's the only one of these cannabis legalization bills that's made it out of a House committee. And so that sort of puts you as, okay, that's kind of like the leader in the clubhouse, where it's already been approved by committee, sent out for further work, etc. It's on the House floor, as opposed to other bills are just in the hopper and they're sent over to committees. And it's a matter, does the committee want to take it up or not? And of course, the Senate is another whole area. The bills are introduced there, but because it's a revenue bill, generally the House is where it's probably going to originate. And then we'll just have to keep following it and see where it goes. I know there's been more talk about it in recent weeks. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are there other taxes? Obviously, you mentioned cigars, so similar to what was done with cigars and that type of thing. So besides, obviously, the MORE Act and what it has, what other taxes might they be concerned about? Excise tax, maybe, that type of thing?
Yeah, this is the excise tax. It's collected on the product. It's okay. Based on a quantity of product, which makes it unique. As similar, like I said, and the way the MORE Act reads, it just makes the tobacco or the cannabis products will be just another line item in the tobacco tax law, which makes your tobacco manufacturer permits, etc., and bonding will all be tied to this new area, just a new product. One thing when you look at the history of it, you go into the Internal Revenue Code has plenty of provisions to address it already there. So if you're just adding an additional tax, excise tax is an established thing. It's been managed by IRS and Treasury alcohol and tobacco tax for a long time. Okay. So it's not like you've got a whole new world. There's a lot of established rulings and procedures that will apply. So
yes, that's good and bad.
Yeah.
So obviously these businesses are up and running. Many cases they've got the licensing, they've dealt with the state. Now we're talking about the federal and some of this taxation thing. So what happens? How do they know what to do if they have changes to their business or their organization or one of their operations, or they add something? What are your suggestions around that?
Well, again, it's diligence, paying attention to it. When you apply for the permit originally, you're going to be establishing a baseline of your company, meaning you're going to show your organizational structure, all the people involved will be registered. And so as you move forward, it's the nature of business that you're going to have officer and director changes. You're going to have plant and premise changes. You're going to have operational changes. And many of those changes are required to be put in as an amendment to your file with the federal government. So somebody should be there to keep on top of that. There's a lot of people you can consult with about it. Some companies have like staff attorneys that keep watch on it, or just simply a compliance officer of some type who can keep track of these things or advise, well, we do need to file this, etc. The biggest changes that we see is when companies restructure, reorganize, or sell to another company, or have a takeover, a stock change that constitutes a change of control. I know a lot of folks, sometimes you'll deal with a restructuring where a corporation will be reformed in an LLC. It's called a conversion. And a lot of state laws allow that. Now, when you convert from the corporation to LLC, quite often they don't even get a new employer ID number, but it's a whole new company. And the TTB enforcement of this is that, well, if it's over a 50% change in control, that's a new company.
Right.
So you have to make a filing just like getting a new permit, and you have 30 days to do that. So the point there is to really stay on top of structure, organization, and we've got to see how much operational data the government's going to want. I mean, if you have a plant that's a certain size and you're adding buildings, quite often they require you to file an amendment to report that you've added another building under your bond.
Yeah.
So those type of changes can be something you really need to keep on top of, be diligent with.
Yeah. Good advice. You know, the federal government's always something to deal with, and you got to be prepared. So, you know, now we're in business, we're getting these licenses, we've got our permits, the federal government's on our back, everything's in place, you know. So after that's done, you know, what kind of timing or what should we expect from you know, when a TTB audit, after they've done all this and gotten their permit, what type of timing do you see? You know, how soon should they expect an audit from the federal government in that environment?
Well, the tax statute limitations for all the taxes is generally 3 years. So the largest taxpayers, by what they have on record as they move forward, you know, the TTB has people to keep track of this and make determinations as to who to audit, and it isn't totally random. In general, if you're a very large taxpayer, you'll see them approximately every 3 to 5 years. And they do select smaller companies as a sample to see that the industry is sort of a spectrum of the industry. So there's no certain criteria, but usually if you're paying pretty large dollar amounts, you'll see them sooner than later. And then the other thing is, if you get started on the wrong foot and you're not filing monthly reports, or there's errors every time you turn around, or your taxes are either not paid or underpaid, or they feel when they look at all the statistics from the reports, if there's something amiss, you may see somebody sooner than an audit. They may be inquiring about, you know, do you know what you're doing, basically.
Yeah.
So
now that makes sense, and I'm sure they watch for that, and that's part of the kickers that kick somebody out for those audits. That's good to know. And so, how do you prepare for those audits? I mean, what are your suggestions? I guess these permit holders now with the federal government, when they get there, they got to know how to prepare. What should they have ready?
Well, it's similar to just about any audit. The TTB auditors are very professional. They will give notice of what they want, but also in preparing for the audits, usually you want to make sure that you've got a record structure, that you've actually taken the line items that are required in the federal regulations and match that up to, okay, I get this number here, and be able to generate proper summary reports and records that carry into the monthly reports, because you're going to have line items for beginning inventory and ending inventory of each month, any gains and shortages, common ordinary accountability issues. What did you receive? What did you process? And then how much did you remove subject to tax, and how much tax you owe will come from that. That's the way it's pretty well structured, is just have your records in place, make sure reports are filed and timely, because that can be a violation if it's chronically late or missing. And then also the tax returns, I would say be absolutely perfect with tax returns on timeliness, because the
Right.
penalties are, as everybody knows, with the IRS, penalties can be pretty stiff.
Yeah, I get it. And one of the things, again, I mentioned it before, I think systems are big in that, and automation. And I know that with Sage Intact and the platform we put together, we've built a situation around the cannabis industry to ensure, like I mentioned, 280E reporting and that type of thing. That will be very helpful as well. And so these audits come, and now we're prepared. So what do they look like? How do they conduct them? Is it in office? I mean, what do they typically do, and what's the result?
Well, normally the way the process is, when they select somebody for audit during a given quarter, they will send a preliminary notice, either via email from the auditors, or a letter will come in the mail that says, hi, we're from the government. We're here to help you with an audit, and so we're going to. Normally, they would come to schedule to come to the premises, and if it's in a very inconvenient time, quite often you can make adjustments. And they'll provide a pretty hefty list of records that they would like you to provide or have available. Because of the modern record systems, there's so much data oriented, they will request downloads of, for example, if you use a accounting software system, they'll want a dump of that. They'll want dumps of your bank transactions. The gnat's whisker to everything of what you do in your records, and they want images of all your reports. Even though they've got access to the reports, they want images of what you've got, so you can prove that they match what you gave the government. All your tax returns, your payments, then they want access to make sure all of your shipments, and with this type of taxation, the prices charged and the taxes paid, and hopefully the taxes paid will properly match what price it's shipped at. And like I said, that's kind of a complex area, but when they're done going through all the records, a site visit will be to examine and more of a review of your ability to comply. They look at your how you design your systems, how you operate. Do you have written procedures, and do you follow them? Do you update them? They're looking at your internal controls that affect your compliance. And then when they reach their results, they're going to they'll provide you with a letter notice of any violation. They'll first do a verbal closeout meeting where they explain to you what they found. And then they send a follow-up letter, which you're permitted to respond to. And then your response quite often will be to explain, okay, you cited this problem and here's how I addressed it. And if there's a major issue, then they might send a follow-up letter that's more cautionary to advise that they're contemplating an adverse action. An adverse action would be either result in a monetary settlement, possibly suspension, and in worst case, revocation of permit. So these are a very serious matter that people should attend to, as being where you can take an audit in stride and successfully get through it, address any issues found, and move on. You don't want to be stuck in a cycle of meetings with the government, explaining things, backtracking. You don't want to get into that.
Right. Yeah, well, and it sounds like you explained pretty well how that process works and what they can expect. So how do they reconcile or adjudicate the tax notices and violations discovered by an audit? I mean, you explained the process pretty well, how it happens, but.
Yeah, when they do find violations, for example, they find a few violations and then they find some tax shortages, they'll give you notice of that. If you agree with the tax shortage, obviously you can pay it, add shortage in addition to your next return or a separate filing of tax. And that's an agreeable thing that, you found to be short, and you pay it. And they'll give you the penalty and interest and everything on that. If they find the shortages are chronic and over a broad period, they may consider that more of a tax case where you've chronically misinterpreted or miscalculated or underpaid. And let's say it's a large amount and you are unable to pay it. The standard rules are just like with income tax, where you can negotiate with the government to settle by, if you don't agree with them, especially by compromise, and that can be based on doubt of liability, which means it's an arguable point and nobody wants to go to court over it.
Yeah, of course not.
The other thing they can do is suspend your permit, which sometimes and quite increasingly they want to have a stipulated suspension in the settlements. And that might be 3 days, 5 days, 7 days that they want you to stop operating.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty serious amount. That's very impactful on a business.
Yeah, I've heard about some of these cases. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can actually, if you're concerned about how they do it, on their TTB website, you can actually visit and take a look at their administrative actions, because if you do what's called an offer and compromise settlement, that's published on there. Your name's there forever. And if you're suspended, your name's there forever. And now
That's
that it's
great.
on the website, there's no way to obscure it.
So ttb.gov, they can go and you can check out and see what's been going on and what kind of cases and adjudications been done. That's real helpful. And again, it'd be scary. And I know that through our conversations, a lot of this is on the come, right? It's in process. They're building it. I think, your experience with the alcohol, tobacco, and the firearms and the TTB and all that is valuable, because it seems to me, and I think most people, that if there's going to be regulation around this, it's probably going to follow or at least mirror what's been done with alcohol, tobacco, and so on, because they're similar situations. And we've all been through that, whether you're in that business or not. We've seen it over the years. So I guess as we kind of get to the end here, just curious what some of your final thoughts are on compliancy in the cannabis industry. What are your thoughts? What are you thinking?
Well, I think it's highly likely, and I have looked at every state. There's too many of them to look at all of them, but have any of them used any other model for regulating other than their alcohol and tobacco regulation? I mean, it's been kind of a universal, and there's quite a history if you go back to the alcohol days in the last century. But one thing to take note of is some of these compliance issues will come into effect maybe before you get your permit, because if the law has an effective date and they haven't acted on the permit application, you may have to start filing these returns and reports. Let's say could be months before you actually receive a permit in the mail because of the transitional rules. So that's something to take note of. But and that's kind of a final idea to kick around. But really, it's, again, just to go back to what I said to start with, is prudence, diligence. What a lot of businesses engage in is making sure they're operating as diligently and carefully and compliant as they can. I work with some great companies that, their motto is 110% compliance. We don't want anybody knocking on our door that we don't know what they're going to find. And so that's a good principle in it, but it takes a lot of resources. I think some modest commitment of resources can go a long way. I've worked with a number of people who just gave no resource to compliance. They were so busy growing their business, they ended up in real hot water with the government, because I've even seen them where they just sit down and don't pay any tax for even years.
Right.
So it just can compound into a really bad issue if you don't attend to it. So.
And as we're wrapping up, there was a question someone had posed, and you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, and as we're winding down, thinking about interstate commerce, how do you think it'll work with different license structures in different states? I mean, will that make a difference or have any impact in terms of what the federal government's doing, again, from your experience? Because the hemp industry is already doing the reporting, so.
Yeah, and I think because of the interstate commerce rules, we have history with alcohol. Originally, you had states that prevented alcohol from even crossing their borders, or regulated it so heavily they would avoid those states in shipping. I think there's a lot of case law in the interstate commerce field that where once, states will not be able to prevent shipments from going through them as interstate commerce, but they'll certainly regulate. A state is not going to be required to permit cannabis in any way. And you'll see some states really lag behind in it. Just like with alcohol, you go back to the days when Utah and Oklahoma just wouldn't allow alcohol.
Right.
Up into the 60s, I believe. So, You're going to see that in interstate commerce has progressed since those days. There probably be less contested issues. We saw that also with like direct delivery of wine to people, et cetera, where the interstate commerce rules have kind of knocked down some of the disparate tax issues and shipment issues that over the years. So I think it's probably an area that's got so much good case law that hopefully that'll be relatively workable for the industry. I won't say good, but workable, because each state's going to have their own little bailiwick to take care of.
You bet. Well, Jim, thank you again. I appreciate your insight. I know we talk about a lot really fast in these half-hour conversations, but I would suggest if people have anybody in attendance or have questions, further questions about compliance or regulation, a lot of things, I would, we could help put you in contact with Jim and the team at Verde. As well, if you're looking in terms of how your systems are going to work and what's there, I can tell you at C2B, we put a lot of effort into coming up with the right kind of solution for the cannabis industry to make sure you are in compliance today in the state world, but actually as the federal is coming, and even with the IRS today. So again, Jim, I appreciate your time. Up on the screen, you'll see we have an upcoming webinar on the 23rd, really about AR benchmarking. Maybe applicable to the cannabis industry or not, depending on your business model, but there's good information there to learn as well. So hopefully you guys can attend, and I thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Jim. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.